All right, trying to learn better strategies and tactics for your essay writing. Let's look at my feedback on that task on your yearly exam. All right, so the question asked, to what extent did strategies and tactics of the French and Viet Minh determine the outcome of the First Indochina War? To what extent? You've got to make a judgment. So this essay question is all about how important were strategies and tactics in determining the outcome, the result of the First Indochina War, that the Viet Minh win. So really what you're doing is you're thinking about comparing the strategies and tactics and showing how, because that's how you make your judgment, showing how they actually help determine the outcome of the war. So to a large extent, to a big extent, they were completely the determining factor. You could have easily made that case, but you could have also made the case that there were other factors too. All right, this is the marking criteria that we use for both essays. So if you look at the A range, 21 to 25, the big words that come through are a clear judgment. Okay, it says / explanation because the Romanov one was explanation. But clear, it's really easy that you're showing a marker that you know how the strategies and tactics actually link to the outcome of the war. But the other ones are the words sustained and comprehensive, which means you keep your argument all the way through. And comprehensive means you see all the pieces of the puzzle, and it's a long essay. You know, you should be writing about, at this stage, I was very happy with A range responses, but they had to be 4 to 5 pages. But in the HSC poppets, it's going to be about 7 to 8. But I didn't expect that this time because we didn't do the stuff in as much detail. Okay, the other key feature of an A response is supports response with detailed, relevant, accurate information. Meaning, I have an idea that I'm talking about, I'm showing that I know how important it is, and then I'm giving the detail to support my idea. That's what an A looks like, and I'll show you what I mean a bit. All right, so how did you guys go? It was pretty good. I was really happy with how the majority of you are going. Probably because the majority of people gave it a really red hot go. They actually wrote an essay, they showed that they had some understanding of the topic, and they completely engaged. So that's why most people were kind of in that CB range, and then some people cracked the A. Okay, so there are kind of 2 approaches that I thought you could do. One, you could just focus on the strategies and tactics, and that was fine. It was totally fine to go, you know, it had a really big impact, so that's what I'm going to make my essay about. So you need to tell me what it is, the strategy or the tactic, and then show how it impacted the outcome of the war. So, bam, I'm talking about Viet Minh and I'm talking about guerrilla warfare, and I'm saying why the guerrilla warfare, the approach about dragging out the war for a long time was really effective because the French didn't have the stomach to stay there for a long time. They also didn't have the resources, even though they were being backed by the US, and the fact that the French government home was so unstable that a long war was always going to make it harder. All right, so that's how you prove to a marker that you're making a clear judgment. The French. So looking at the French tactics. Defensive forces in the major cities. So I'm including this stuff here to show you that it's not just about Dien Bien Phu, it's about the whole First Indochina War. And they waited for the Viet Minh to attack then, which meant that they were going to have to wait there for a while because the Viet Minh, of course, countered that by using guerrilla warfare because they knew in these big defensive fortified cities they'd never be able to beat them. There was a heavy reliance on artillery. People made the really clear point that, hey, they were fighting a European-style war. They hadn't been able to adapt to the conditions, and that this meant that it was really ineffective. So even if, you know, even though, more importantly, even though they had far more artillery than the Viet Minh, and they had all of this capability, it didn't matter because they couldn't use it in the conditions because the Viet Minh wouldn't fight in the way that they wanted them to fight. And then you should have led to a discussion of a clear case of this is Dien Bien Phu. Talk about, you know, the poor choice of location. Talk about the airstrip being a terrible idea, talking about how in those jungles there was no way that they were going to be able to manoeuvre and use the artillery effective. Even the soldiers' uniforms and packs had them at a total disadvantage, which meant that, even one example about, their feet, they got all these diseases, which had huge psychological and practical implications. The French. Guerrilla warfare should have been the bulk of your response. There was so much to say. So people talked about that, it was the example of the tiger and the elephant, which was great, or that they attacked at night, that they were surprise attacks, that it was that when the French would advance, they would retreat. All of those things you need to explain to me and show a marker that you know what guerrilla warfare is. Right, so why was it important? It allowed them to fight on their own terms, which allowed them then to control the war, which had them at a huge advantage. They used nationalism as a weapon. If you're going to talk about that as a strategy, which is totally the right way to go, you need to show how it actually impacted. So you talk about Ho Chi Minh identifying the dissatisfaction with the French, that he went in and the Viet Minh went in with propaganda units and got the villagers on side. This then meant that the villagers were now a huge resource. It meant that they would feed them, that they would give them intel, that they would be even volunteer to support. And this meant that the French didn't know who they were fighting, that they were able to fight for so long. Ho Chi Minh talks about them being like the fish in the sea, meaning that the Viet Minh were like the fish who could easily hide in the bulk of the sea because they were, being hid by all the people in the jungles, the locals of Vietnam. All right, so this nationalist strategy, getting the locals on side, gave them this huge opportunity. All right, so why and how do you link it? You need to link the strategy to the essay question, the outcome of the Indochina War, because that actually shows that you get it. So that's what you want to demonstrate to a marker. Not that you just know all this stuff about guerrilla warfare, but you know how it actually applies to the question. So here are two ways that two people did this. This meant that the Viet Minh clearly had the upper hand in relation to moving around the land, which in the end determined who won the war. So you're linking with the whole idea about being adapted, their tactic of being able to adapt to the surroundings, which meant that they were able to move, they were difficult to see, which in the end determined who won the war. So they've made that link. Another one is like these tactics, meaning the French, did not suit the conditions, nor could they combat the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Minh. So I've done all my discussion about the poor French tactics and then said my last linking sentence, which shows that I'm understanding how the French tactics meant that they couldn't win the war. All right, this is my favourite sentence that I read. The Viet Minh resupply was achieved through utilising the cover of forest and night. While in a conventional sense it was weak, it had the advantage over the French system of airfields in that it was inconspicuous. This shows such a depth of knowledge. One, all right, resupply is important in war, that they do it under cover of forest and night, while in a conventional sense it was weak. So they're even showing an understanding that they're fighting an unconventional war, and then they show how it links to the French over the French system of airfields. So if you're able to do that, that was a really effective way of answering this question. Okay, approach 2. You could say, yeah, strategies and tactics were really, really important, but it was only one factor. There were other factors. But you still must deal with strategies and tactics because they're the main event. They're the things that are highlighted in the question. So you need to make sure that you deal with that before you deal with other factors. A lot of people talked about the poor treatment of the Vietnamese by the French, which was good, but you can't, if you go right back to World War I and talk about all of those, the poor treatment there, or even further back, it's such a long bow to draw, meaning that you should be dealing with something that's happening, in the 1950s. And so to think that, it had its roots all the way back then, sure, it's a long-term or a contributing factor, but you really need to think about the things that are far more immediate. Role of nationalism. So I talked just before about how you can say that it was a strategy, and you could. It was really good if you did that. But you could have also said, okay, define strategies and tactics far more narrowly in a military sense, and then brought in the role of nationalism. That it didn't matter what the strategies and tactics were, because the Vietnamese were so nationalistic and committed to seeing the French gone, that the war would have gone on, that Ho Chi Minh tapped into that, and that was far more important than the strategies and tactics. Some people brought in the Cold War, which was legitimate, and I think it was really legitimate to talk about the Russians and the Chinese doing it, supplying the Viet Minh. But I think to talk about America in this way, they certainly supplied the French, but they didn't commit in a huge way because they were dealing with other issues. So they really commit to it really becomes a Cold War conflict when they actually become far more engaged after the French are out. So it was a little problematic, so if you're going to do that, you need to really make sure that it links to the question. So finally, things to avoid. Storytelling. So a lot of you didn't do this, and I was so proud of you that you really tried to stick to that essay structure and use the narrative to support your discussion. But sentences like this just flag to a marker that you're telling a story, and they'll want to put you in a C range. So things like, however, what the French didn't know was that. And watch the emotive tone to your writing. Again, you're not going for a shock jock or a breakfast television thing. You want to think about your idea about, using evidence to create an argument and win your case that way. So avoid things like they fought for their families, futures, for their nation and for freedom. Don't use rhetorical questions in essays. It's incredibly irritating for a marker, and it's not the place for them. So when the world found out about this victory, a lot of people asked, how did the French lose? It's not that style of writing. It's not a speech where you want to kind of engage your audience. And please avoid personal pronouns, so the use of I. All right, so there's my feedback on that essay. I hope you find that helpful. And congratulations. And you could apply this not only to this essay, but kind of the things I'm saying, especially this stuff to avoid in all your essay writing.